Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm Alan, the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast, and today's Tolkien Times is my way of bringing you a little Middle-earth every single day. Now, of course, if the few minutes you get here isn't enough, be sure to listen to the Prancing Pony podcast. 7 years worth of long episodes, an hour and a half, 2 hours, sometimes more, as we walk our way through the Legendarium. But let's get started today with our very first Word Nerd Wednesday. We'll use this time on Wednesdays to dive deep into the world of Tolkien's languages. Not just the ones he created like Quenya and Sindarin, but the real-world ones that he used like Old English. Not to mention the archaic and unusual regular English words that he used so often that our first time reading the Legendarium was sometimes accompanied by a dictionary. This entire segment, by the way, is a big salute to my good friend, the Lord of the Mark himself, Sean Marchese. Sean co-hosted the first 6 seasons and 261 episodes of the Prancing Pony podcast with me. And he's my co-author on Why We Love Middle-earth, our book that's being published in September of 2023. I'll often go back and look at words that we looked at together in our Philology Faire segments on the Prancing Pony podcast. So if you hear Sean speaking through me, that is no accident. And today we're going to honor Sean's efforts by going back to the very first Philology Faire we ever did, back in episode 55 in October of 2017 on the word dwarves. Now, if you remember our episodes on The Hobbit in Season 2, you'll remember that we made a few cracks at Walt Disney's expense because of his use of the plural dwarfs. Now, these days, it's normal to see Tolkien's dwarves with a V in modern fantasy literature, video games, tabletop RPGs, and more. But in 1937, it most certainly was not normal. Tolkien is the one responsible for popularizing this spelling of the plural. In fact, his good friend C.S. Lewis does not use the V version of the plural dwarves in his Narnia books, instead using the F version, dwarfs. In a preface to The Hobbit, written in 1966, which was included in several but not all editions, Tolkien explains about some linguistic choices, including goblin, runes, and dwarves. He writes, "In English, the only correct plural of dwarf is dwarfs, and the adjective is dwarfish. In this story, dwarves and dwarvish are used, but only when speaking of the ancient people to whom Thorin Oakenshield and his companions belonged." Now, he goes on to explain it in more detail in Appendix F to The Lord of the Rings. He says, "In this book, as in The Hobbit, the form dwarves is used, although the dictionaries tell us that the plural of dwarf is dwarfs. It should be dwaros, or dweros, D-W-E-R-R-O-W-S. If singular and plural had each gone its way down the years, as have man and men, or goose and geese. But we no longer speak of a dwarf as often as we do of a man, or even of a goose, and memories have not been fresh enough among men to keep hold of a special plural for a race now abandoned to folk tales, or at last to nonsense stories in which they have become mere figures of fun." Now, what he's referring to there is the sound changes from Old English. The word then was dweorg, plural dweorgus. So the changes over time that turned dweorg into our modern word dwarf should also have changed dweorgus into dweros. But it didn't, because people just didn't talk about them enough to keep an irregular plural around. Now, Tolkien goes on to say something like that. "But I have ventured to use the form dwarves and remove them a little, perhaps, from the sillier tales of these latter days," which I think he's talking about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So he's trying to give his dwarves some of their old dignity back, as opposed to the silly dwarfs of folklore, from Rumpelstiltskin to Sneezy. But earlier, in a 1937 letter to Stanley Unwin, which is in the letters collection as number 17, Tolkien had explained it then by saying, "I'm afraid it is just a piece of private bad grammar, rather shocking in a philologist. The real historical plural of dwarf, like teeth of tooth, is dwaros anyway. Rather a nice word, but a bit too archaic. Still, I rather wish I had used the word dwaro." I get the feeling that Tolkien was just really dead set on the form he wanted to use because he knew it was more philologically correct, even though it wasn't grammatically correct for modern English. And we all know that when Tolkien was set on something, that's just the way it was. He knew dwaro was just a bit too archaic, which for Tolkien is really saying something. So he came up with a compromise form, dwarves, which sounds so right that it has become arguably the preferred form for fantasy dwarves. And it doesn't even sound odd to us anymore. Truly the work of a master philologist and language inventor. Now that's it for today's Philology Faire, Word Nerd Wednesday. But come back as we explore the wide, wild, wonderful world of words on Wednesdays. And if there's a word you want to know more about, don't forget to let us know by emailing barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. For now, though, plan on joining me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for our very first Third Age Thursday. Please like and subscribe on YouTube, and if you're listening on a podcast app, be sure to subscribe to make sure every episode gets downloaded to your device. Follow @Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, and in the words of Faramir, go with the goodwill of all good men.